cicadas were the first choir Lucian ever learned to listen to, long before jazz horns and riverboats and the breath of the French Quarter at midnight. There was the steady, shimmering hum of summer nights around Magnolia Hall. Back then, he was not a creature of shadow and blood. He was a boy standing barefoot on a gallery of weather-worn cypress boards, staring out over rows of cane that rolled away like dark water in the dusk. Magnolia Hall sat on a rise above the fields, its white columns streaked with years of rain and sun. It was grand, but not as pristine as the old stories insisted. Paint peeled in quiet, private places, and ivy had begun to creep up the bricks where no one thought to pull it down. Lucien loved it more for those flaws than for any polished surface. He had been told since he could walk that the land was his birthright, the hall, the sugar fields, the live oaks that reached for one another above the long drive, branches laced like fingers in prayer. Your great-grandmother built this life, his mother would say, with her hands, her mind, and a little help from the spirits who favored her. His mother, Elise, was a gentle woman with watchful eyes. His grandmother, Colette, was not gentle at all, but she could be kind in ways that did not always look like it. From the day he first understood words like inheritance and legacy, Lucien was taught two things. The first, you must believe in the good in people even when they show you the worst. The second, believing in the good does not mean ignoring the shadows that made you. On bright mornings, Magnolia Hall looked like every painting of Southern prosperity anyone ever bothered to commission. Sunlight on white plaster, servants moving in quiet, practiced lines, the clatter of dishes, the smell of coffee and biscuits and cane syrup. On those mornings, young Lucien would sit at the big dining table, legs too short to touch the floor, swinging gently as he listened to his grandmother talk about the land. "Respected," Colette would say, tapping her crooked finger against the table for emphasis. The land remembers who walks on it. It remembers who digs in it, who bleeds on it, who sings over it. You give it care. It gives you back a living. You take from it with greed. It takes from you in other ways. His mother would smile and smooth his hair, softening the warning. People are like that too, Elise would add. They remember, so you treat them fair. You keep your word. You look for the good first. Lucien believed her. He wanted to. He liked to think the hall and its fields were held up by more than old money and old names. He liked to imagine they were held up by the weight of promises kept. But on nights when the summer storms rolled in from the Gulf, lightning flashing over the swaying cane, his grandmother told a different kind of story. those nights Colette would sit him down in the small parlor instead of the grand salon. The small parlor was where the real history of the house lived, not in portraits and polished silver, but in little things on crowded shelves. Bundles of dried herbs tied with red string, a chipped blue bowl that had never seen a formal table but never left the house, a candle stub burned low in a saucer, wax hardened in curious patterns. On the wall hung a small, almost faded portrait of a woman whose eyes seemed to follow you no matter where you sat. "Marie," Colette would say when she caught him staring, "your ancestor, the one who knew how to speak to the ones on the other side of the veil." "Marie Laveau?" he had asked once, stumbling over the famous name. His grandmother's mouth twitched. "People in the city call her that," she said. "People who wanted her help, or wanted to fear her, or wanted to pretend they understood what she did. Here, we call her Grand-Mère Marie, because without her, there would be no Magnolia Hall and no you." Lucien would listen, lightning reflecting in the glass of the portrait's frame. "She didn't start here, you know," Colette said once, her voice going low, like it always did when the past got close. "Your Grand-Mère Marie was born where the cane grew sharper than knives, and the sun felt like punishment." Lucien could see it as she spoke, even though he'd never left Louisiana. Fields that looked like Magnolia Halls, but louder somehow. More people, more heat, more anger trapped under the soil. "On that island," Colette went on, "every day was a prayer and a dare. The masters prayed you'd stay quiet. We dared the spirits not to forget us." She told him about the nights when Marie was just a girl, bare feet in the black mud behind the quarters, listening to drums that weren't supposed to be there. While the big house slept, the people gathered in a clearing hidden by trees and dark. Someone beat a skin drum with the flat of their hand. Someone else shook a rattle made from a gourd and pebbles. Old songs, half remembered from across the ocean, slipped into new words no one had written down. "Your grandmère watched," Colette said, "and she learned. She learned which leaves cooled a fever and which ones could stop a heart. She learned which names made the air change when you said them, and which prayers you whispered only in your blood. By the time she was old enough to braid a woman's hair, she could braid a curse into it if she chose. Then the stories turned. The fires came next," she said. "You've heard bits of that, I know. Men like to tell the part where the great houses burned. They don't tell you about the small rooms that burned first." Lucien imagined it. Nights split open by shouting, by gunshots, by the crack of cane fields catching like dry straw, smoke thick enough to hide the stars, the rich running for their ships with trunks and jewels clutched to their chests, the enslaved running with nothing at all but their own names. Marie saw men who had whipped her mother crawling in the dirt, Colette said, and there was no softness in her tone now. She saw women who'd been bent double in the fields, standing up straight for the first time in their lives, faces lit by firelight. Everyone thought they knew who was strong and who was weak until that night. Lucian leaned forward, barely breathing. She could have taken a knife to every man who'd ever raised a hand to her, Colette continued. Don't think she didn't want to, but she watched some of them die in the fields and some drown in the sea, and she realized something the rest didn't. What? Lucian asked. That there's a difference between vengeance and balance, Colette said. Vengeance is you and your anger. Balance is you and the spirits and the land all together. She decided she'd rather spend her life helping the world remember what balance felt like instead of chasing every cruel man with a blade. When the worst of the fighting passed, the island was changed. No chains the way they'd been before, no masters in the same clothes, but there were still hungry mouths, still roofs to patch, still ghosts that sat at the edge of every fire and would not lie down. Your grand-mère understood something else then, Colette said. She knew the battle on that island wasn't the only one. Folks were still in chains in other places. The same kind of men who'd run from her homeland were already buying new land across the water. So Marie went down to the shore. She walked right into the sea, up to her knees, Colette said, and she talked, not to any priest, not to any man, to the ones who'd been with her people long before there was a word like Haiti at all. In Lucian's mind, he saw her, skirts soaked, hair loose around her shoulders, salt spray on her face as waves tugged at her legs. She spoke into the wind, into the dark, into the crash of water on sand. She told them, if I stay, I will spend my life patching the same wound. If I go, I can carry what we learned here to a place that still thinks it can't burn. The sea didn't answer in words, but the tide shifted. The boats that had seemed full suddenly had space. A captain who'd sworn he'd take no more passengers looked at her and felt his mouth saying yes before he knew what he'd agreed to. She boarded with a bundle of clothes and a head full of names. Colette said around her were planters who'd lost everything and still thought themselves better than the people they'd tried to own. There were free folk with papers crumpled in their hands like they could ward off fate. There were women with babies on their hips and men with scars on their backs, all of them staring at the same black water, wondering which part of their lives had really sunk. Nights on the ship, Marie stood at the rail. The sky over the gulf was different from the sky over the island, but the stars were the same old witnesses. She poured a little water from her cup into the sea each night and whispered a name into it, someone who hadn't made it off the island, someone whose story she refused to let stop there. When she saw the mouth of the river for the first time, Colette said softly, she almost turned around. It was all mud and fog and mosquitoes and churches with bells that didn't ring for people like her. She knew the kind of city that river fed. French on the tongue, chains on the wrists, priests at the front and cruelty in the back rooms. Lucian could see New Orleans as she must have seen it then, low and damp and shining in patches, a place built on compromise and denial. but she also felt the river itself. Colette's eyes had gone distant, remembering stories told to her at her own grandmother's knee. Rivers know about carrying things. They know about taking what no one else wants to claim. She felt it push at the ship, and she thought, "All right, if you'll have me, I'll make you remember what we learned in the fire." Marie came ashore with everyone else. No grand welcome, no trumpets, just a woman with clever hands and a spine that had learned never to bend unless she chose. She let them call her a hairdresser, a servant, a midwife, whatever made the city comfortable. All the while, she was listening, learning who lied and who paid priests to bless the lies, learning which alleys stayed cool even in August, learning who in that place still believed the spirits heard them when the church doors were closed. And when the time was right, Colette finished, she went looking for land, not just any patch of ground, a place where the river's dreams came close enough to touch, and where the soil remembered what it was to rise up. She chose this hill. She chose Magnolia Hole before it had a name. And she didn't just build a house. She rooted a piece of that island here, so none of us would ever grow up thinking our story started in these fields. Elise would sigh when these stories grew too dark. "Mama," she would chide softly, "he does not need the old ghosts yet." But Lucien wanted them. Even as he tried to be good, tried to be fair, tried to see the best in everyone who came through Magnolia Hall's doors, there was a wild hair in him that twitched whenever his grandmother mentioned the word bargain. He wanted to know what it meant to ask the world for more than it thought it was willing to give. Still, he followed the rules he had been given. He treated the workers with kindness. He remembered their names, their children, their small complaints about weather and wages and aching backs. He watched his mother oversee accounts to make sure wages were paid on time, that no one was cheated of cornmeal or cloth. He sat in on meetings with merchants from the city, watching their smiles never quite reach their eyes as they talked of sugar prices and shipping schedules. "Always listen more than you speak," Elise would whisper to him when they left. "See what they are not saying. Their silence can tell you more than their words." But the wild hair in him, the restless part that belonged not to ledgers and polite conversation, but to herbs and red string and candle stubs, never rested. It tugged at him when he walked the edge of the fields at night and felt the soil shift softly under his bare feet. It pricked him when he saw his grandmother slip a little packet into a worker's hand with a warning not to open it until they were home. It burned in him quietly every time he heard the older folks in the quarters lower their voices when he passed, only to lift them in laughter again when they thought he was out of earshot. He decided somewhere between boyhood and the first thin mustache on his lip, that he was going to find the truth of it all. It began with a ledger. He found it one slow afternoon when the sky was a high, washed-out blue and the air too heavy for work outside. The house felt sleepy, like a cat in a patch of sun. Curiosity, always his most dangerous companion, nudged him toward the big house's library. The library at Magnolia Hall was not as large as some city mansions boasted, but to a young man with restless thoughts, it was a kingdom. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling. The books smelled like paper and dust and secrets. Most were dull things. Legal codes, agricultural reports, volumes of sermons, dog-eared romances that had belonged to some aunt or cousin long gone. But there were other books, too. On the highest shelf, in a corner where the afternoon light did not quite reach, there was a row of ledgers bound in cracked brown leather. He had seen his grandmother take one down once, years before, and then put it back with a look on her face that said, "Not yet." Now he dragged the rolling ladder over, climbed and traced the spines until his fingertips caught on the one with a faint, almost invisible mark burned into the leather. Not a letter. Not a number. A symbol that looked like a cross or a star or a road meeting itself, depending how you turned your head. He pulled the ledger free. It was heavier than it looked. On the table below, he opened it gently. The first pages were what you would expect from a plantation ledger. Dates, names, purchases, debts, harvest tallies. Then the numbers changed. There were entries with no coin values next to them. No sacks of sugar. No barrels of molasses. Only names, sometimes with a single word beside them. Justice, favor, revenge. Sometimes there were phrases written in a language he did not recognize, looping and sharp, the ink darker, as if pressed into the paper with more force than necessary. Halfway through the book, a different hand took over. The letters grew larger, more confident. The loops of the script bold and sweeping. On the inner margin of one page, in a flourish that tried and failed to disguise its impatience, someone had written M.L. Remember, each gift is owed twice. Lucien stared at those initials. M.L. Marie Laveau. His heart thudded once, so hard it made the lamp flame flicker. The world tilted a fraction, as if the house itself were taking a breath. He turned the page. Here, the entries were not ledgers at all. They were stories, written in a compressed hand that struggled to fit its own urgency. A woman whose husband drank and beat her, a bag of herbs buried under his doorstep. a whispered song, a promise he would be turned away from the bottle as from a snake, a man who coveted another man's land, a warning that if he took it by force, the river would remember his face. A child sick with a fever that would not break, a bath in a certain mixture of leaves and oils, prayers said in a language that tasted like salt and fire in the mouth. Some entries ended with the word paid, others ended with nothing at all. As he read, Lucian began to see Magnolia Hall differently. It was not just rows of cane and accounts. It was a web of favors, debts, bargains made in kitchens and back porches and under live oaks with their roots deep in the old soil. His great-grandmother had not simply built a life here. She had woven herself into the very bones of the place with threads that were not meant to be seen by sunlight. He felt a strange mix of pride and unease. Pride because the blood in his veins came from someone powerful enough to bend the will of the world, even a little. Unease because power like that did not come without cost. Each gift is owed twice. He turned another page. This one was different. A loose sheet had been tucked between the pages. It was thinner than the ledger paper, tanned almost translucent with age. On it, in that same firm hand, was a list, not of people, not of favors, of names and places. Beside some, a small symbol, a circle, a crescent, 3 short lines like rays. At the bottom, in careful, deliberate script, was written, Haiti, fire, blood, sea. A chill walked down Lucien's spine despite the heavy afternoon heat. He had heard stories about the island, whispered tales of revolt and plantations burned, of enslaved people who broke their chains with fire and iron and things unseen. His great-grandmother had come from that. She had carried that history inside her, across the sea, and poured it into this land. Elise always spoke of her as a healer, a wise woman, a negotiator. Colette spoke of her as someone the spirits listened to. The ledger suggested something more complicated. Lucian realized, sitting there with the book open in front of him, that for all their stories, there were things his mother and grandmother had chosen not to tell him, things that might scare him away from the path they half hoped and half feared he would take. He closed the ledger gently and rested both hands on its cover. He could put it back, pretend he had never seen it. He could keep believing in the simple version of Magnolia Hall. Good land, hard work, fair dealing, and he would still be, in some way, the man his mother wanted him to be. he would never truly understand the itch that crawled under his skin when the wind carried certain scents from the quarters at night. He would never know why he woke some mornings with words on his tongue that belonged to no language he was ever taught. He opened the ledger again. This time he flipped to the back. The final pages were less full. The handwriting here became shaky, then steadier in a different style. His grandmother's, he realized. She had continued Marie's work in smaller ways, perhaps, but with the same understanding that every favor was a thread in a larger pattern. In the very last entry, written in Elise's neat, careful hand, were only 3 words. Let him choose. No explanation, no date, no name. Lucienne stared at those words until the afternoon light began to slip toward gold. Let him choose. Him. The ledger was not just a record. It was an invitation. He pressed his palm flat against the page, feeling the faint ridges where pen had scored paper decades before he was born. He did not know yet that one day the choice it offered would lead him to a quiet street in New Orleans, to a night where the river sang and the air tasted of magnolia and iron, to a man named Lucien Laveau who would no longer be warm, for now he was just a young landowner standing on the threshold of 2 worlds. The bright one his mother believed in, and the shadowed one his great-grandmother had written into the margins of history. Outside, the cicadas' song swelled with the heat of the evening. Inside, Lucien closed the ledger, slipped it under his arm, and carried it toward the small parlor where his grandmother's herbs hung drying from the ceiling. If he was going to inherit Magnolia Hall, its land, its people, its future, he decided he would inherit all of it. The good, the dark, the bargains, and the blessings, because somewhere deep in his bones, in the part of him that always felt like it belonged to the river and the old island both, Lucien knew that pretending not to see the shadows did not make them disappear, and he was tired of walking through his own house with his eyes half closed. That night, for the first time, he asked his grandmother to tell him the stories without soft edges, and she did. By the time the candles burned low and the moon climbed high over Magnolia Hall, Lucien Laveau understood that the line between healer and witch, between landowner and something more dangerous, was thinner than anyone polite ever admitted. He would spend years walking that line, trying to be good, holding on to the belief his mother planted in him, that people were more than the worst things they had done. But the ledger and the land and the blood in his veins would never let him forget that the wild hair in his nature came from a woman who had crossed an ocean with fire at her back and spirits at her side, and that one day the bargains she made would come due in him.
Thank you for tuning in, and if you are enjoying these writings, please like and subscribe so you won't miss out on the next chapter. Until then, happy dreams!